Prior to the last Epoch, it's been an incredibly long time since I've even launched an ARPG. As a matter of fact, the last one I ever played was Darkspore, believe it or not, because truth be told, ARPGs just never really clicked with me like traditional RPGs such as Skyrim or MMOs like WoW. But with the hype built up around Diablo over the last couple of months, I started itching for some good old hack and slash action. Thankfully, I didn't waste any money on Diablo 4, but I did obviously purchase Last Epoch after a lot of consideration. And I've gotta admit that although I am having a lot of fun, I also have several personal issues with the game that have hampered my enjoyment quite a bit. However, I'm going to be extremely transparent right off the bat and say that this video overall will be a lot more subjective than my previous content. But I will start this off on a positive note and say that at the surface level, the core gameplay loop is really solid. Basically, you just kill, loot, level up, and repeat. It's extremely simple, but still very engaging. With that being said, once you dig a little bit deeper, some of the game's flaws start to become uncovered. My first major complaint is with exploration. Maps look fine visually and every zone has been really varied from what I've seen so far. Where the problem arises is that the game just feels super linear. There's typically a handful of paths beside the main one to choose from on any given tile set, but they almost always seem to just put you back onto the main path in one way or another and don't offer much of a reward for deciding to explore them. The most you'll get out of it is a one-shot chest with some pretty mediocre loot that can mostly just be found by killing trash mobs. Occasionally, you'll find a rune prison housing an exiled mage mini-boss, which can be a fun challenge sometimes, and it also serves as a great way to test your build. These guys always drop experimental items which are pretty much just another tier of gear. Overall though, exploring off the beaten path just never feels rewarding enough for how much time it consumes. There's very rarely any side quest to accept when exploring outside of town hubs, and it never even feels necessary to stop and grind some XP off of enemies along the way because you're constantly over-leveled, which brings me to my next complaint, being that the campaign is just way too easy and way too forgiving. Now look, don't get me wrong, okay, it's not like you can just run around with a zero effort build and a full loadout of common gear and expect to steamroll everything, but at the same time I never felt like I had to play strategically at all. The only time I ever felt like I was in any real danger was during an exiled mage fight, or if I just pulled way more enemies than I knew I could handle. As a matter of fact, the exiled mages so far have felt harder than any boss I've fought in the game because they move much faster and seemingly much less predictably, and trash mobs are basically as the name would imply. Even named enemies with affixes never seem to pose any real threat. I think what this stems from is the fact that the game just gives way too many handouts early on in regard to build crafting. For reference, I have 4 characters, a Spellblade, a Lich, a Void Knight, and a Sorcerer, and on every single one of them, I felt like a god before I reached level 10, and even before I got to pick my mastery class. This game hands out skill points like candy on Halloween, and it kinda gives off the same energy as a participation trophy. Like you didn't really do anything to deserve it, but it makes you feel good regardless. On top of this, you're able to specialize in up to 5 different skills with one skill at levels 4, 8, 20, 35, and 50. Now I will say that these skill points aren't nearly as easy to obtain because they require you to actually level up each individual skill, with each level of course becoming progressively harder. The main issue with being handed all these skill points is that so many early game passives revolve around lifesteal and or damage being stacked on damage. As a result of this, the combat is just completely brain dead. By the time I was level 30 on my Void Knight, I had so much lifesteal that I could literally just sit on top of a boss, face tank it, and spam Rive until it died. I was one-shotting rooms of trash and elite mobs with a racing strike before I even hit level 25. And you're probably asking, well, what's wrong with being strong in the early game? And I will gladly tell you. When you're granted too much power early on, it makes the end game completely and utterly pointless. If I'm already one-shotting trash mobs and melting bosses at level 30, then what's the point of me playing for another 50 hours to achieve max level and grind gear sets and perk points and try new builds? And sure, some builds might be more enjoyable than others, but at the end of the day, if it achieves the same result as my character does now with a unique weapon I got from a world drop, and a couple subpar random pieces of gear I found off of trash mobs, then what's the point of me spending hours to theory craft new builds? If I already feel like a god within the first 3 hours of playing, it might be able to keep my attention for a little bit longer, but once the novelty wears off and I realize that I've been pressing the same button for the last 5 hours to kill everything in sight, the game is going to become progressively more and more boring, and I'll have no interest in continuing to play. Now, I do want to clarify that I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the build system. As a matter of fact, I think it's actually really great. There's a lot of unique abilities that you can spec into, each with their own perk trees that allow you to customize exactly how you want the ability to behave, and there's also plenty of passive perks available. My only real complaint about build crafting besides it making you overpowered way too early in the game is that there seems to be a big reliance on using just one single skill. On all my characters so far, I've been able to go all in on one single ability and use it for single target, AoE, and sometimes lifesteal or healing. Although each ability does have a fairly unique skill tree, I just wish they had a little bit more of their own identity, so that I'm not just spamming the same thing over and over again, whether I need to heal, kill a boss, or nuke a room. Going back to what I said earlier about the campaign being too forgiving, it seems that there's no real penalty for dying. When you're playing the campaign, you typically spawn about 100 feet from where you died and just pick up right where you left off with full health and mana. However, if you die in a boss room, you do have to reset completely. But regardless of where you die, you don't lose any durability or get any sort of debuffs. And on top of that, enemy health doesn't even reset. And don't get me wrong, on the surface I understand how this sounds super convenient and awesome, but when you're actually playing the game, it just kinda makes it unengaging and boring. There's no real reason to actually play strategically in the campaign because I know that when I die, I'm gonna be right back where I was 5 seconds ago with no penalties. I feel like this completely trivializes most encounters and makes fighting trash mobs in particular more of a detour and annoyance on your path to the next main objective, rather than an actually engaging part of the gameplay. To sum it up, I think the campaign is simply just way too easy to actually be engaging. In my own personal opinion, if you hold the player's hand at every second, they're eventually going to get really bored, and consequently, they probably won't ever reach endgame because at a certain point, it seriously becomes so mind-numbingly boring with how easy it is. And before you go type up a rage comment about how monoliths and endgame are so much more challenging, monoliths require several hours to reach, so here's a very friendly reminder that games shouldn't take multiple hours of playtime to get good, and if someone doesn't want to dig through trash to reach treasure, it's perfectly valid for them to just quit the game. Don't get me wrong, okay, monoliths are amazing, but I think the campaign and early game leveling needs to be completely rebalanced, otherwise I have a feeling that a lot of new players won't stick around long enough to fully explore what the game has to offer. The only reason I stuck it out is because I have a long history with RPGs, so I was already coming in with the expectation of grinding for dozens of hours before reaching true in-game content. To quickly summarize how monoliths work, basically once you hit level 25 you unlock your first monolith, and in this monolith there will be echoes. You have to complete one echo before you unlock another one, and each echo has its own rewards and objectives. Now, I won't lie to you, I still didn't find monoliths to be as challenging as I'd hoped. Like, I didn't need to pull out all the stops and play perfectly, but it was still a good bit more engaging than the campaign, and it unironically revitalized that spark in me to continue playing the game. It felt like I had to actually make full use of my kit rather than relying on one ability to carry me, and I had to time my own attacks as well as dodge out of enemy attacks rather than face tank them and rely on lifesteal to carry me through. On top of this, there's actually penalties to dying, such as losing echo rewards and being forced to restart, so it makes me want to actively play the game rather than just stick around and spam abilities like I'm untouchable. With monoliths and difficulty out of the way, we're going to move on to some more aspects of the game. So far, my favorite aspect of the game is definitely the looting. Enemies drop loot way more often than not, and there's always plenty of elite mobs to go around that love to drop rares and uniques. There is absolutely no shortage of gear to find, and it feels really great to be constantly rewarded with upgrades. Even unique gear drops very often, and it can lead to some really fun builds. You have a helmet slot, chest slot, amulet slot, 2 ring slots, boots, a belt, gauntlets, a weapon slot, an offhand slot, a relic slot, and finally idols, which are typically just basic stat buffs, but can sometimes offer something unique to your class. You can mix and match hundreds of unique pieces of gear to create the perfect balance of stats. And a really neat part about this game is that none of the weapons are locked to classes with the exception of bows for rogues. So if you want to play a melee acolyte or a sentinel with a staff, it may not be very viable, but you can do it. There is, however, a lot of armor and relics locked to classes, as well as a handful of idols. Speaking of classes, there are currently 5 you can play, each with 3 different masteries to choose from, excluding the Acolyte and Rogue, who currently only have 2, but to my knowledge will be getting a 3rd alongside the full launch of the game. You get the Sentinel, Rogue, Mage, Primalist, and Acolyte. Some examples of masteries are Void Knight for Sentinel, which is a melee-focused class that uses Void Magic to dispatch enemies, and Sorcerer for Mage, a ranged class that uses the power of fire, ice, and lightning to burn, freeze, and shock their foes. There's quite a large variety of classes and masteries to choose from, each with their own unique passive trees, so it shouldn't be hard to find something you enjoy playing. There's also a pretty great crafting system that honestly I still don't completely understand, but I think I know enough about it to give a simple rundown. Basically, each item has what's called forging potential. You can add or upgrade up to 4 different affixes on any given item using affix shards, and it's going to cost a random forging potential within a specific range, but I'm not entirely sure what the range is or what affects it. There's plenty of different affix shards to choose from, such as physical damage, elemental resistance, and health. And you can also use support glyphs and or modifier runes to modify the outcome of a craft. And of course, to store all of this wonderful gear that you either loot or craft is an even more wonderful stash system. In this game, you unlock the stash almost immediately, and here's the kicker. You get unlimited storage space without paying any real money. You do of course have to purchase stash tabs still, but they're pretty cheap and only require gold that you earn in game. Also, your stash is shared across all of your characters. And finally, the graphics are decent, but nothing impressive, honestly. The footage you're seeing is maxed out graphics on a 6700 XT, and the game runs buttery smooth at 120 FPS. With all that being said, I think I covered just about everything important. I know I kinda shit on the game a little bit hard earlier in this video, but I do truly enjoy it, and I think it's got a pretty solid foundation with tons of potential. The main campaign is just incredibly unengaging, and the game doesn't really feel that enjoyable until you reach monoliths, which could be a big turnoff for a lot of people. I think that with a little bit of tweaking, this could easily be a 10 out of 10 ARPG. As it stands, it's already a great game, but as I've mentioned, it has quite a few flaws in my opinion. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.